I now recognize Mr. Mfume from Maryland for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Chair Winstrup, and to the Ranking Member Ruiz. I say for having this hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here. A couple of quick things. First, an observation. I just believe that the title of this hearing is a bit narrow in scope, perhaps even misleading, to say churches versus synagogues. But in the district that I represent, there are churches, there are mosques, and there are synagogues versus casinos, I should say. So if we really are trying to draw a juxtaposition here, and the assumption here is that only churches are affected and therefore only Christians were affected. So perhaps next time around we'd want to, if we believe in this, we'll want to say churches, mosques, and synagogues. And let's keep before us also the 1.1 million people who are not here, who died as a result of COVID. Oftentimes these hearings and these discussions talk about a lot, but we don't oftentimes talk about them and their families. And I think, as I've said at every hearing, we've got to do that. We also, as I've said at every one of these hearings, have to realize and recognize, I think, that we were dealing with a public health emergency and nobody had answers. And everybody was trying to figure out what was right, what was wrong, how do we protect each other and one another. I mean, I remember a time during the pandemic where people were washing their groceries that were left on their doorstep by a delivery person, believing that there were germs on the Cheerios box that would infect their family. So, you know, it just behooves us to remember how strange those times were and how we didn't know and why it was so very important that we found a way, until we did know, to protect people and as many people as possible. It's good to be a Monday morning quarterback, but the game of life is not played that way. And there are real winners and real losers, and the 1.1 million that died and their families are losers. So I don't know if we ought to be blaming anybody and using the Constitution as a shield to suggest that in an emergency we should not do everything that we possibly could to get out of it. Now, there's a lot of anger and a lot of angst that I hear over and over again. I hope this does not devolve into the Andrew Cuomo show, because that's not what we're about here. And, you know, I don't have an issue with Mr. Cuomo. He was not my governor. But if you do, that's fine. But the issue here is, how do we find a way to talk about what we did and why it made sense at the time and not to condemn? Some of my colleagues have suggested that public health measures implemented during COVID-19 deliberately placed a disproportionate burden on communities of faith, hindering their ability to freely practice their religion. And while there are variances of that theme throughout the country, one thing is clear, that churches, synagogues, and mosques found a way to get around any restrictions that might exist to be able to worship. Was it corporate worship with 1,000 people in the same room? No. But I just find it a little offensive to suggest that as a Christian, I didn't worship, my church didn't worship, my family didn't worship. I've got friends who are Jewish and friends who are Muslim who tell me the same thing, that they either found a way to do it virtually, or like we did, we'd meet outside, as you heard earlier from my colleague, during the cool months, and then when it got cold, we'd worship in our homes with our family members and our neighbors. So if you really are trying to practice your faith, you're really not going to let a pandemic and the restrictions that are imposed at that time stop you from doing it. Maybe I'm a different kind of person, but I've seen what's happened and what continues to happen, how religions are practicing worship and are doing so even now that the pandemic has come to a conclusion. So if you look at the Journal of Infectious Diseases, they compared the COVID-19 spread in states with and without stay-at-home orders and found out, as we all know, that states with stay-at-home policies were more successful in slowing the spread of the disease in the weeks and months following the initial outbreak than those that did not. There are some lessons to be learned here, and I understand the anger and the frustration, but we're in real time when this was taking place, and this is real time now. So I have always had a hesitancy of pointing backwards and saying, this is the blame, you're the blame, that's the blame, when the key was, how do we find a way to save lives? How do we protect our families and families around us? And how do we use the most sensible policies at the time to be able to do that? Policies that clearly now have shown to save lives. We just didn't save that 1.1 million Americans that are no longer with us. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to take the opportunity to appreciate your discussion on the title of this hearing, because clearly more than one religious faith was negatively affected through this process. I now recognize